There was a house in Cedarhurst on the southern edge of Long Island that looked like every other house on its street. A man lived there with his family, a heavy-set man with a voice like gravel poured down a chute, the product of decades of cigarettes, and he liked nothing in the world so much as the sound of that voice. He talked in the kitchen, he talked in the den, he talked in the dining room and on the telephone and on the sidewalk and in the cars of everyone unlucky enough to give him a ride. What the man did not know, through the early 1980s, was that the federal government had placed listening devices inside the walls of the rooms where he did most of his talking, and that the tape was always running. The first law of the world this man belonged to could be reduced to a single instruction: say nothing. Everything else, the loyalty, the silence around bosses, the refusal to admit the organization even existed, descended from that one rule. And this was the man who could not obey it. He was not a boss. He was not trying to become one. He was something stranger, and for the people around him, far more dangerous. He was the one who could not stop talking, and the recordings of his voice would become the single most useful gift that federal prosecutors ever received from inside the most powerful criminal family in America. Those recordings would help kill one boss and crown another. They would supply the legal key that unlocked doors no agent had ever expected to open. They would put his closest partners in prison for half a century each, and in the end they would help destroy the one man the talker loved most in the world. He was warned. He was told the walls were listening, told it directly, and still he could not stop. His name was Angelo Ruggiero, and the tape kept rolling. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from right now, because I always like to know who is out there. If stories like this are what you come here for, take a second to subscribe so the next one finds you. Now, back to the house in Cedarhurst and the man who never learned to stop talking. The man in the house was not a boss, and he was not trying to be. What he was, for almost his entire adult life, was the closest friend and most trusted confidant of a man who would become the most famous gangster in American history. When John Gotti rose to the top of the Gambino crime family, he kept Angelo Ruggiero directly at his side, and he handed him a job that required absolute discretion. Ruggiero was put in charge of planning murders. The contradiction at the center of his life is almost too neat to be true. The family entrusted its most secret and most lethal work to the one member who was constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret, and it did so because the man who ran it loved him and could not see the danger until the danger had already swallowed them both. The nickname told the story to anyone who knew how to read it. They called him Quack Quack. The name had two origins, and both were insults. The first was his manner of walking, a flat, waddling, side-to-side gait caused by a painful condition in his feet, the kind of duck step that made him recognizable from a block away. The second origin was the one that mattered. He quacked. He talked endlessly, compulsively, about everything, to everyone, a running commentary on every grievance and every scheme and every man he hated, delivered in that cement mixer rasp to anyone within earshot. Everyone who came into his orbit had to endure it. The gossip and the complaints and the indiscretions, an unbroken stream of words that started the moment he sat down and did not stop until he left. One Gambino capo, John Carneglia, put it as plainly as it could be put. He told other criminals that if you dialed any 7 numbers at random, there was a 50-50 chance Angelo would answer the phone. In nearly any other circumstance, that reputation alone would have been a death sentence. A man who talks is a man who can hurt you, and the people in Ruggiero's world solved that problem the only way they knew how, which was to make the talker disappear. But Ruggiero was protected, first by blood and then by friendship, and so he kept talking, and the government kept listening, and the result was a body of recorded material that law enforcement officials would later describe as one of the most remarkable oral histories of a major criminal conspiracy ever captured. He narrated the inner life of the Gambino family directly into federal microphones, and he did it for years, and the men around him could only watch and worry about what he might be saying next, in what room, within range of what. That is the paradox the whole story turns on. To understand how one man's voice came to matter that much, how a single talkative capo could help bring down an empire that had survived everything the government had ever thrown at it, you have to go back to a poor stretch of Brooklyn and to two boys who became inseparable. Angelo Salvatore Ruggiero was born on July 29th, 1940, and raised in the East New York section of Brooklyn. His father was a first-generation immigrant from Naples who, unlike so many of the men his son would come to serve, had nothing at all to do with organized crime. His mother was named Mary, and her maiden name was Della Croce, and that name would shape the entire trajectory of her son's life. Through his mother, Angelo Ruggiero was bound by blood to Agnello Della Croce, a man who would rise to become the underboss of the Gambino family and one of the most feared figures in the American underworld. The exact label for the relationship varies between accounts, with some sources calling Ruggiero a cousin and others a nephew, but the substance of it is not in dispute. The boy from East New York had a powerful relative inside the organization, a man whose word carried weight at the highest levels, and that relative would protect him long past the point where any sensible boss would have let him live. Without Agnello Della Croce, there would be no story to tell, because Angelo Ruggiero would have been killed for his mouth before he ever became famous for it. The neighborhood produced more than one future legend. Ruggiero grew up alongside two boys who would become as significant as anyone in the history of the modern mafia. One was John Gotti, born the same year, raised in the same kind of poverty, drawn to the same streets and the same trouble. The other was Salvatore Gravano, who would one day be known as Sammy the Bull, who would one day rise to underboss, and who would one day undo everything by deciding to talk to the government himself. They were children of the same hard streets before they were criminals together, and the bonds formed there held for decades, until the bonds themselves became the instruments of mutual destruction. It is one of the strange symmetries of this story that the same three boys who ran together in East New York would each, in his own way, bring an empire to ruin. Ruggiero was a high school dropout, and his adolescence read like a charge sheet. He was arrested through the 1950s for street fighting, for public intoxication, for car theft, for bookmaking, for possession of an illegal firearm, and for burglary. Some of those arrests came while he was in the company of John Gotti, the two of them already a pair, already pulling jobs side by side. In 1966, the partnership produced one of its more absurd episodes when Ruggiero and Gotti were arrested together for trying to steal a cement mixer truck. They were not yet important men. They were street thieves with a talent for getting caught, working the edges of a Queen's crew, run out of a club where the older men watched the younger ones and decided which of them were worth promoting. But the world they were climbing into was vast and structured and patient, and it had rules that went back generations. The Gambino crime family was the largest of the 5 families of New York, and in this era, it was a house divided against itself in slow motion. Carlo Gambino, the boss who gave the family its name, had ruled for years through quiet maneuver rather than open violence, and before his death, he made a fateful choice of successor. He named Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, a man of business who preferred the white-collar rackets and ran the family from a mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island that the agents who watched it called the White House. He kept Agnello Della Croce as underboss, and Della Croce led the other half of the family, the traditional half, the street half, the men who hijacked trucks and broke legs and kept to the old ways, out of social clubs in Queens. Della Croce was unhappy with the decision, a man who many believed had earned the top job himself, but he swallowed his disappointment for the sake of unity. Above the family sat the commission, the ruling council that the bosses of the major families had created decades earlier to settle disputes and divide territory, an institution that gave the American underworld a structure more durable than any single man. It was a world with its own laws and its own courts and its own death penalty, and it had outlasted every effort to destroy it. The two factions of the Gambino family coexisted inside it in an uneasy peace, the suits and the soldiers, the boardroom and the gutter, and the scene between them ran directly through the lives of the men who came up under Della Croce. Angelo Ruggiero was one of those men. So was John Gotti. The thing that would bind them for life was not a crime they got away with. It was a killing. On May 22nd, 1973, 3 men walked into a bar on Staten Island, One of them was Angelo Ruggiero, one was John Gotti. The third was a Gambino gunman named Ralph Gallione. They had come for a man named James McBratney, an Irish criminal who had made the catastrophic mistake of trying to kidnap a Gambino loan shark for ransom. The leadership wanted McBratney dead as a lesson to anyone who imagined the family's people could be taken for money, and the job of teaching that lesson fell to the young men eager to prove their worth. The attempt to take McBratney quietly fell apart almost at once. When he refused to come with them and began to struggle, the plan collapsed into open violence, and they shot him where he stood, in front of a room full of witnesses, and fled into the night. It was not clean work, and the messiness of it had consequences. They were identified, and they were caught, and both Ruggiero and Gotti were eventually convicted in connection with the killing, pleading to attempted manslaughter and going to prison. The sentences were short, almost insultingly so, for a man gunned down in a crowded room, a reflection of how thin the case had become and how good the family's lawyers were. But the short sentence was not really a punishment at all. It was an apprenticeship. Inside, both men learned what the life demanded and proved they could absorb it, and they came out hardened and trusted in a way they had not been going in. The two men were released on parole in July of 1977, and what waited for them on the outside was not further punishment but reward. Their performance, crude as it had been a service to the family, and the family paid its debts. Ruggiero and Gotti were inducted as made men, formally initiated into the Gambino family in a ceremony that brought together the very top of the organization. The boss, Paul Castellano, was there. The consigliere, Joseph Gallo, was there, and the underboss, Agnello della Croce, was there. The blood relative whose personal affection for both young men, law enforcement would later conclude, was the real engine of their elevation. Della Croce loved these two as if they were his own, and his love opened the door that turned two paroled killers into sworn members of the most powerful crime family in the country. To satisfy the conditions of his parole, Ruggiero took a job that was a job in name only. From 1977 onward, he was carried on the books as a salesman for a plumbing and heating company owned by Gambino Associates, a no-show position designed to give a paroled killer the appearance of honest employment. He did not sell plumbing. He went back to what he knew, the loan sharking and the gambling and the hijacking that flowed through the crew operating out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Queens, the crew that John Gotti would come to run as his own. The two friends were now soldiers in the same army, sworn members of a family that demanded everything from the men inside it and promised, in return, a place in a brotherhood that was supposed to last until death. That loyalty was tested in the most terrible way in 1980 in an episode that revealed exactly what kind of man Ruggiero was when his friend needed him. John Gotti had a 12-year-old son named Frank, and one afternoon the boy darted into the street on a mini-bike and was struck and killed by a neighbor named John Favara, who never saw him coming. It was, by every account, a genuine accident. Favara was no criminal, but in the world the Gotti family inhabited, the distinction between an accident and an offense did not always hold. Some months later, after a period in which Favara received threats and found the word murderer scrawled on his car, he simply vanished. He was never seen again, and he was presumed murdered, his body never found. Angelo Ruggiero was among those suspected of involvement in the disappearance, the loyal friend handling the unspeakable on behalf of a grieving boss. Nothing was ever proven, and the case remains formally unresolved, but the episode is part of the record of who Ruggiero was. He was the man you called for the things that could never be spoken of, which made it all the more remarkable and all the more dangerous that he could never stop speaking. They had been made under Paul Castellano, and Paul Castellano had one rule he intended to enforce above all others. Angelo Ruggiero had a younger brother, and the younger brother was the one with the real money. His name was Salvatore, and where Angelo was loud and grasping and perpetually short of cash, Salvatore was disciplined and ambitious and astonishingly successful at the one thing the family's boss had forbidden. Salvatore Ruggiero was a heroin trafficker of the first rank, a man who had come up under an older Gambino capo connected to the Bergin world, a figure who was content to take a share of the heroin proceeds, while letting the younger man do the building, and then built something of his own, the ringleader of an operation known as the Pleasant Avenue Connection, a network that moved enormous quantities of Southeast Asian heroin into the New York area and stood as a forerunner to the even larger smuggling pipeline that investigators would later call the Pizza Connection. The trade made Salvatore a millionaire many times over. It also made him a hunted man. He was so deep in the business and so wanted by the authorities that he became a federal fugitive in the mid 1970s, charged in multiple indictments with extortion and tax evasion and trafficking, and he spent years living under assumed identities, hiding out in Florida and Ohio and Pennsylvania while his money kept flowing and his associates quietly held his properties in their own names to disguise who really owned them. For all his involvement in the trade, Angelo never came close to the wealth his brother had accumulated. He remained, in the end, a prosperous street-level operator rather than a true power, a man who complained constantly that he was not earning what he believed he deserved, forever chasing a fortune that stayed just out of reach. The resentment over money ran through everything he did, and it would surface again at the worst possible moments. The contrast between the brothers is the quiet engine of the whole tragedy. Salvatore had the discipline and never got to enjoy it. Angelo had the protection and squandered it. The one who knew how to keep quiet died in the sea, and the one who could not keep quiet inherited his business and his danger both. Heroin was the fault line of the entire Gambino family, and it ran straight through the Ruggiero brothers. Paul Castellano had decided that narcotics were too dangerous to tolerate, not on moral grounds but on practical ones, because the enormous sentences that came with drug convictions gave the government the one thing it had always lacked: the leverage to turn made men into informants. A soldier facing 50 years would talk. A soldier facing a lesser charge might hold out. So Castellano issued an edict. Any member of the family who had been initiated after a certain year was strictly forbidden from any involvement in narcotics, and the penalty for violating the rule was death, plain and immediate. He did not stop at his own family. He pressed the National Mafia Commission, the ruling council of the American underworld, to adopt a family-wide ban carrying the same automatic sentence, so that no boss anywhere could shelter a dealer. The edict was not an abstraction. It was aimed, everyone understood, directly at the Della Croce faction, at the Bergin crew, at John Gotti, and at Angelo Ruggiero, men Castellano had come to suspect were not only dealing heroin but growing rich on it behind his back while they smiled at him on Sundays. And they were. The Bergin crew was in the heroin business, and Angelo Ruggiero was in it as deeply as anyone, working with traffickers and moving product and chasing the kind of money his brother had made look effortless. The problem was that he was doing it under a death sentence handed down by his own boss. Ruggiero's solution to this problem was the solution he applied to everything, which was to talk his way around it. He lied upward, constantly and confidently. To Castellano and to his uncle Della Croce alike, he insisted that he was not dealing drugs himself, that he was merely tidying up the loose ends of his fugitive brother's affairs, settling Salvatore's debts and closing out Salvatore's deals, that there was nothing for the boss to worry about. It was a lie that held together only so long as one condition remained true. No one could ever be allowed to hear what Angelo Ruggiero said when he believed he was among friends, and while Ruggiero was telling his bosses one thing and doing another, the government had already begun to listen. On November 9th, 1981, a federal court granted the FBI permission to listen to Angelo Ruggiero's home telephone. The investigation belonged to the Bureau's Gambino squad, working out of Queens, and at the outset it was aimed at the ordinary business of the crew, the loan sharking and the illegal gambling that the agents already knew the Bergin men were running. The agents had a particular interest in this particular phone for a reason that captures the whole tragedy of Angelo Ruggiero in miniature. He had told informants that the line was safe, that it could be used without fear, and so it was the line on which he spoke most freely. The number was listed not in his own name, but in the name of his young daughter, a girl called Princess, a small domestic detail that did precisely nothing to protect it. Within months, the agents were listening to Ruggiero openly discuss the rackets he ran with John Gotti and with Gotti's brother Gene. narrating the operations of the crew into a recording device as casually as another man might describe the weather to a neighbor. The intrusion went deeper than the telephone, and the reason it went deeper says something cold about how Ruggiero was seen, even by the men closest to him. The FBI had a source inside the Bergin crew, an associate named Wilfred Johnson, and Johnson, for reasons that were never fully explained, hated Angelo Ruggiero with a personal and abiding intensity. Of all the targets he could have given the Bureau, Ruggiero was the one he seemed most determined to ruin. He spoke of him with open disgust, and he gave the agents something invaluable. He provided detailed floor plans of Ruggiero's home and specific recommendations on where, room by room, a listening device would do the most good. Acting on that intelligence, the FBI obtained authorization to plant electronic bugs inside the house itself, hidden microphones in the kitchen, the den, and the dining room, the very rooms where the talking happened. Popular accounts of this period differ on the exact dates and even on which house was wired first, and the residence chronology in the secondary record is genuinely muddled, with sources placing the surveillance in different years in different towns. What the federal court documents establish is that the listening devices were placed inactive in the spring of 1982, authorized and then extended through a series of court orders, and that they captured a man who never once imagined the walls were paying attention. The harvest was extraordinary, and it was extraordinary precisely because Ruggiero was who he was. He did not merely answer questions that incriminated him, because no one was asking him questions. He volunteered. He gossiped. He ranted. He confessed. He speculated. He insulted his superiors and described his crimes, and reminisced about killings. All of it captured. All of it preserved on reel after reel. Carneglia's line about dialing any 7 numbers was not a joke inside the family. It was an expression of dread, a fear the other members carried about what Angelo might be saying, and to whom, and within range of what. The fear was entirely justified. The government would come to possess a body of Ruggiero recordings so rich and so detailed that investigators regarded it as a kind of spoken encyclopedia of the family's structure, its membership, its rivalries, and its crimes. The man had effectively dictated the organization's deepest secrets into a machine, and he had done it for the price of his own vanity, because more than anything, Angelo Ruggiero loved an audience. For the agents on the Gambino squad, it was an experience without precedent. They had spent careers piecing the families together from fragments, from a name here and a sighting there, from informants who knew a little and would say less. Now they sat with headphones in a monitoring room and listened to a made member of the Gambino family simply tell them everything, unprompted, hour after hour, the names and the grudges and the deals and the bodies, a confession that never knew it was a confession. The hardest part of the work was no longer gathering the information, it was keeping up with the flood of it. Much of what the microphones caught was contempt, and a great deal of it was aimed upward at the boss himself. Every other Sunday, Ruggiero made the drive out to the mansion on Todd Hill to report to Paul Castellano on the earnings of the Bergin crew, the dutiful captain delivering his tribute and his accounting. Then he went home and said what he really thought, and the machines took it all down. He mocked Castellano as soft, as a man who had grown remote from the streets, a boss who lived like a corporate executive while men like Ruggiero did the dangerous work. He ridiculed the legitimate poultry business Castellano's sons ran, sneered at the white-collar advisors the boss kept around him, and belittled the relatives Castellano had placed over the family's interests in the garment district. None of it was the kind of thing a soldier was ever supposed to say about his boss, and all of it was now sitting on federal tape, a recorded record of disloyalty that would have meant death if Castellano had ever heard it. The contempt was real, and it was widely shared inside the Della Croce faction, but Ruggiero was the one foolish enough to broadcast it into a wired room. Then, on a clear morning in May, a small jet fell out of the sky, and everything the microphones had been waiting for arrived at once. The chartered Learjet lifted off from an airport in New Jersey on the morning of May 6th, 1982, bound for Florida. Aboard were a pilot, a co-pilot, and a married couple traveling under names that were not their own. The man with the small briefcase was Salvatore Ruggiero, 6 years a fugitive, on his way south to look at property, and beside him was his wife Stephanie. The pilot had checked the conditions and been told it was a good day for flying, clear skies all the way down. The flight was routine until it was not. Less than 2 hours after takeoff, the aircraft went down in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of southern Georgia near Savannah. There were no survivors and no clear explanation for why the plane had fallen. Whatever the impact did not destroy, the sea did, and Salvatore Ruggiero, the disciplined brother, the wealthy brother, the brother who had built an empire out of heroin and silence and had never once been caught talking, was simply gone. His body never recovered whole. His death set off a chain reaction that would ultimately reshape the entire Gambino family, and the first link in that chain was forged within days, almost within hours. Angelo Ruggiero was notified that his brother was dead, and his first response was not grief, it was logistics. Salvatore had been a fugitive with a fortune in heroin and cash hidden away in his hideout, and that fortune was now unguarded, sitting in a house in New Jersey with no one to claim it but the family. Angelo, together with John Gotti and John Carneglia, drove directly to the dead man's hideout to recover everything they could find, the drugs and the money and any paperwork that might tie the living to the dead man's business. The lawyer Michael Coiro, who had handled matters for the brothers before, arrived to help untangle the estate of a man who had officially not existed under his own name for years, and the microphones in Ruggiero's home recorded all of it. The bugs were already live when Salvatore died, which meant that the most sensitive conversations of the most sensitive moment imaginable fell directly into the government's hands without the agents having to lift a finger. The FBI captured the lawyer Coiro, offering his condolences, and then, almost in the same breath, confirming that Jean had located the heroin at the hideout. That single recorded sentence accomplished something the agents had pursued for months. It connected the Bergin crew directly to narcotics, and it connected narcotics directly to a close relative of John Gotti. The talk of heroin in the immediate aftermath of Salvatore's death seized the full attention of the investigating agents, and an inquiry that had begun with loan sharking and numbers now had the makings of a major narcotics prosecution aimed at the very heart of the family. But the recordings from those days captured something else, something that complicates any easy picture of Angelo Ruggiero as a fool or a clown, and it is worth sitting with because it is the most human thing the tapes ever preserved. Behind the closed door of his own home, mourning the brother he had just helped to strip of his hidden wealth, Ruggiero spoke about his loss to his trafficking partners. He told them that when the news reached him, he had said to himself that he would have to get drunk, that he drank 2 vodkas, that he went into his room and shut the door and wept. He said the hardest thing to bear was that his brother's body had not been recovered whole, that it had come apart in the sea. And then he said something that revealed, more than any confession of any crime, the world he had chosen to live in. If Salvatore had been shot in the head and left in the street, Ruggiero said, that he could have accepted, because that was part of the life they had all agreed to, a death with a meaning and an author, a death you could answer with another death. It was the blank meaninglessness of an accident at sea, a death no one had ordered and no one could avenge, that he could not bring himself to accept. The cruelty of it is that this private grief, the most unguarded moment of his entire life, was also evidence. The machine in the wall did not distinguish between the confession of a crime and the confession of a sorrow. It recorded both with the same indifference, and both would be used against the men in that house. What the microphones had captured there would not stay there. Because the tapes existed, the government could now argue to a court that there was probable cause to listen somewhere far more important than the home of a mid-level capo. This is the part of the story that elevates Angelo Ruggiero from a colorful failure into a genuinely consequential figure in the history of American law enforcement, because the recordings made in his dining room did not merely incriminate the men who spoke in it. They became a legal foundation, a brick in a wall that prosecutors built ever higher. The evidence developed through the Ruggiero surveillance gave the government a basis to seek authorization to listen elsewhere, and the chain of inference that began in that house in Cedarhurst extended outward and upward through the whole organization. To understand why that mattered so much, you have to understand how the government's war on the Mafia was being fought in those years. For decades, the families had been nearly untouchable at the top because the bosses gave orders that soldiers carried out, and the distance between the word and the deed was almost impossible to prove. The federal racketeering laws were changing that, allowing prosecutors to treat an entire family as a single criminal enterprise. But the laws were only as good as the evidence, and the best evidence was a boss's own voice describing his own crimes. Bugging the home of a boss was the holy grail of organized crime investigation, and it was almost never achieved because the bosses knew better than to talk where they could be heard. The single most important door the Ruggiero material helped open belonged to Paul Castellano himself. The legal predicate built in part on what Ruggiero had said helped make it possible to place listening devices inside the boss's own mansion on Tot Hill, and the material gathered there fed into the sprawling federal prosecution that became the Mafia Commission Trial, the historic case that for the first time put the bosses of New York's five families together in a single courtroom and treated the commission itself as a criminal enterprise. A talkative captain in Cedarhurst had helped hand the government a key to the front door of the family it most wanted to destroy, and the lesson did not stay confined to one case. What the agents learned in those years, that the surest way into a family was to get a microphone into the rooms where its members felt safe, became a template for everything that followed. The era of trying to flip a single frightened informant was giving way to an era of patient electronic invasion, of bugs in clubs and cars and kitchens, and the Ruggiero recordings were among the early proofs that the method could reach all the way to the top. In that sense, the man who could not stop talking did not merely damage his own family, he helped demonstrate the technique that would be turned in the decade to come against all of them. In 1983, the government brought its narcotics case, indicting Angelo Ruggiero alongside John Gotti and John Carneglia on charges of conspiring to traffic in heroin. The case rested heavily on the recordings, on Ruggiero's own voice describing the very business his boss had forbidden on pain of death. And here the danger of the tapes turned inward, away from the courtroom and toward the family itself, because the existence of the recordings created a crisis that had nothing to do with prosecution and everything to do with survival. Word of the affidavits began to circulate, and panic spread through both factions. The Della Croce men who feared what was on the tapes, and the Castellano loyalists whose boss had condemned to death exactly the conduct the tapes described. For a long time, astonishingly, Ruggiero did not seem to grasp the danger he was in. He behaved like a man who believed he could outmaneuver the people listening to him, and his attempts to do so are almost painful to recount. In 1984, he was introduced to a man who said he had a source inside the telephone company, someone who could find out who had authorized the taps and how deep the investigation really went. Ruggiero paid the man roughly $1,000 for the information. The man came back with a reassuring story. The taps, he reported, had been authorized under a court order in a different federal district, which suggested that Ruggiero was only a minor figure in an investigation aimed at someone else entirely. It was exactly what Ruggiero wanted to hear, and he believed it. The trouble was that the man he had paid was not a telephone company insider at all. He was an undercover FBI agent posing as a repairman, and the comforting story he had sold Ruggiero was a deliberate fabrication designed to keep the target talking. Ruggiero had paid the very people listening to him for the privilege of being lied to. His confidence held even as the evidence closed in. He moved to a freshly renovated home and spent tens of thousands of dollars on the renovations, telling associates that the new house would shake the agents off, that the surveillance was a bluff, that nothing was going to come of any of it. He was wrong on every count. The agents had tracked his calls and were watching on the day he moved in, and the listening continued. Then, in 1985, the illusion finally shattered. Ruggiero obtained a copy of one of the government's own surveillance affidavits, a document that laid out the true depth of the investigation in black and white. It revealed that the friendly telephone man had been a federal agent. It confirmed that his home had been invaded by multiple hidden microphones, and it made plain that the government had heard, in his own voice, the things he had spent years denying to Paul Castellano and Agnello della Croce. The man who had never been frightened of the tapes was, by the accounts of those around him, suddenly terrified, because he understood at last that the lie he had told his bosses was about to be exposed by his own recorded words. And here's a detail that defines him completely. Even after he knew, even after the affidavit lay in front of him, spelling out exactly how thoroughly he had been heard, he did not stop talking. He tried to speak in code. He grew uneasy. He took small useless precautions, but the compulsion was stronger than the fear. The words kept coming, because they always had, because the man and the talking could not be separated. A different man might have gone silent and saved himself. Angelo Ruggiero could not, and somewhere in that inability lies the whole of why he ended as he did. When Castellano was arrested on racketeering charges and learned that his own home had been bugged, he also learned the reason the agents had been able to get inside. The Ruggiero recordings were part of the legal justification. The boss who had forbidden narcotics under threat of death now understood that one of his own members had been captured on tape discussing narcotics in detail, and that those very recordings had helped the government violate the sanctuary of his home. Castellano demanded the tapes. He wanted to hear what Ruggiero had said, partly to measure the extent of the exposure, and partly, everyone in the family understood, to decide whether the man who had said it should be permitted to go on living. Ruggiero refused. It was an act of defiance, so reckless that it can only be explained by the same compulsion that governed everything he did, an inability to surrender anything, even when surrender was the only thing that might save him. He would not hand over the recordings. When his uncle Della Croce, caught impossibly between his boss and his own blood, tried to broker a resolution and gently suggested the tapes be produced to calm Castellano down, Ruggiero accused the old man of betrayal for even entertaining the idea. He told his own attorneys that he would kill them if they gave the recordings up. He clung to the tapes because he had convinced himself he needed them to fight the heroin case, and he clung just as fiercely to his lie, the story that he had only been closing out his dead brother's affairs, even as the recorded proof of his own dealing piled higher around him. Sammy Gravano, who watched all of this unfold from inside the family and who would one day tell the government every part of it, reduced the matter to its essence. It was Angelo's big mouth, he said. Angelo was caught on tape all over the place, talking constantly about precisely the things he was least supposed to mention to anyone alive. Gravano was careful in his later telling to put distance between himself and the disaster, insisting that the tapes were Angelo's problem, and Gotti's problem, and Paul's problem, that he himself had never been in that house and was on none of the recordings in any form. But he acknowledged the larger truth that came to hang over the entire family like a verdict. People would conclude, in the years that followed, that those tapes and the things on them led in the end to Paul Castellano's downfall. The recklessness of one mid-level talker had become a structural threat to the survival of the organization itself. The one man who could protect Angelo Ruggiero from all of it was dying. Agnello della Croce died on December 2nd, 1985. He had been sick with cancer for some time, and Ruggiero had been a constant presence at his bedside, the devoted nephew to the very end. But devotion could not alter the diagnosis. With Della Croce gone, the shield that had hung over Ruggiero for his entire career was simply removed in a single stroke. The underboss had been the reason Castellano had not already ordered Ruggiero killed over the tapes, the human buffer standing between the boss's fury and the man who had created the catastrophe. Now that buffer was in the ground, and the man who had broken the family's most sacred rule, who had been recorded breaking it, who had then refused to surrender the proof, stood completely exposed before a boss who had every conceivable reason to want him dead. What happened next was one of the most famous acts of violence in the history of American organized crime, and it is important to be precise about Ruggiero's place in it, because the temptation is to make his tapes the sole cause of everything that followed, and the honest record does not support that simple version. There were many grievances against Paul Castellano building inside the Della Croce faction. There was resentment at his cold white-collar distance from the men who did the dangerous work, at his enforcement of the narcotics ban that cut directly into their incomes, at the widespread sense that he was bleeding the street crews dry while he and his circle of advisors prospered. The tapes were one pressure among several, an especially sharp and immediate one, but they were not the only one, and they were probably not even the deepest one. Gravano, who took part in the decision and helped carry it out, was clear that the move against Castellano grew out of accumulated anger and accumulated fear, with the tape problem feeding into the fire rather than standing alone as its single cause. The honest summary is that the recordings were one of the things that made the killing feel necessary, not the whole of it. On December 16th, 1985, 2 weeks almost to the day after Della Croce was buried, Paul Castellano and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti, were shot to death on a Manhattan sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse, cut down by a team of gunmen in the early winter evening as the city's Christmas crowds moved around the corner. Angelo Ruggiero was part of the operation, stationed with a backup team of shooters down the street, ready to act if the primary team failed in its work. He was never called into action. The killing went exactly as it had been planned. The boss and his second died on the pavement among the holiday shoppers, and by the end of that night, John Gotti had made himself the boss of the Gambino crime family. The friend who could not stop talking was now the right hand of the most famous criminal in America, elevated alongside the man he had grown up with on the streets of East New York. As boss, Gotti handed the planning of murders to the man he trusted most, and that turned out to be a serious mistake. The role suited Ruggiero's standing within the family and his lifelong closeness to Gotti, but it did not suit his temperament in any way, because the planning of murders is, above everything else, work that rewards discretion and patience and cold sound judgment, and Angelo Ruggiero possessed none of those qualities in any reliable measure. He was, by the accounts of nearly every man around him, volatile to the point of genuine menace, ruled by his temper and his grievances. He once tried to frighten a pair of intended victims by claiming that he kept man-eating sharks in his swimming pool and would feed them in alive. He threatened on another occasion to murder the FBI agent who had bugged his house, a threat so self-evidently catastrophic that John Gotti himself had to sit his old friend down and patiently explain why killing a federal agent would bring the entire weight of the government down on all of them and end everything they had built. His incompetence as a planner became unmistakable in 1986, in an episode that nearly cost him his own life and revealed how dangerous his pride could be. Ruggiero learned that Anthony Casso, a soldier in the rival Lucchese family, who was widely and accurately feared as one of the most prolific killers in the entire underworld, had called him an idiot. Wounded in his vanity, Ruggiero decided to have Casso murdered for the insult. The contract passed down through a chain of intermediaries until it reached a young Staten Island thug named James Heidel, who ambushed Casso and shot him several times and, against all odds, failed to kill him. The failure was complete and it was costly. Casso survived his wounds, traced the attempt back to its source, and exacted a revenge designed to be remembered. Heidel was kidnapped and tortured for hours before he was killed, and his agonizing death was turned into a deliberate warning, aimed straight at the man who had ordered the botched hit. The whole affair rattled Gotti's confidence in his friend badly and exposed the central problem of Ruggiero as a captain. The family was now ushering Gotti into the upper reaches of the rackets, the rooms where serious money and serious strategy demanded lieutenants with intelligence and restraint and the ability to think past an insult, and Ruggiero kept demonstrating again and again that he had none of those things. In June of 1986, he was at the center of another killing, the murder of a fellow capo named Robert DiBernardo, a man known in the family as Di B. The two men had each been positioned as a possible successor to fill a vacancy near the top of the family, which gave Ruggiero a motive of ambition, and DiBernardo was also said to have been talking subversively, questioning Gotti's leadership while the boss was away, dealing with his own legal troubles. Gotti gave the order from jail, and Gravano carried it out. But there was a complicating fact that the record never fully resolves. Ruggiero owed DiBernardo a substantial sum of money, a debt put at roughly $250,000, and Gravano, the man who actually pulled the trigger, later wondered openly whether that debt had played some part in how eagerly Ruggiero pushed the murder forward and how hot he kept the boss's anger burning. Whether the contract was pure family business or whether Ruggiero's own balance sheet helped seal DiBernardo's fate is something the historical record does not establish with certainty, and it should not be claimed as settled. What is clear and undisputed is that Ruggiero was at the center of it, urging it on, relaying the boss's fury, insisting the thing be done and done quickly. And through all of it he kept talking, including about the boss himself, the friend who had elevated him. The same recordings that captured his crimes captured his contempt. He was overheard insulting John Gotti behind his back, calling him names, complaining that Gotti talked too much and abused the men under him and was wrong about any number of things, an accusation almost too rich to bear coming from the mouth of Angelo Ruggiero. And in nearly the same breath he would speak of his love for Gotti, calling him a brother, a man he would do anything for. Both things were entirely true at the same time, the loyalty and the resentment, the devotion and the gossip, and both went onto the tape in his unmistakable voice. Other members began complaining directly to Gotti that Ruggiero was running the crew's rackets into the ground, that he was a poor manager and a worse earner, that for all his closeness to the boss, he had become a liability who cost more than he brought in. After the Casa disaster, even Gotti's deep patience reached its limit, and Ruggiero was shelved, set aside from the active business of the family, his authority quietly stripped away. By the time the heroin case finally reached a jury, the talker had run clean, out of room to talk his way out. The case the tapes had built went to trial, and then it went to trial again, and then again. The narcotics prosecution that grew out of the recordings proved maddeningly difficult to bring home, not because the evidence was weak, for the evidence was the man's own recorded voice, but because the proceedings kept collapsing under the weight of suspected corruption. The first trial of Ruggiero, John Gotti, and John Carneglia ended in a mistrial. A later attempt, before a different judge, ended the same frustrating way, with the jury unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Both collapses carried the strong and unmistakable odor of jury tampering, the sense that the panels had been reached and frightened or bought, that the same family muscle and money that ran the rackets in the street was reaching quietly into the jury room. The government, refusing to let go, kept refiling, kept impaneling new juries, kept trying to convert the voice on the tapes into a conviction that would stick. The case the prosecutors had assembled was a sprawling thing, built around the dead brothers' heroin network and the men who had served it. The indictment named a long list of defendants drawn from the Bergin crew and its associates, and the government lined up witnesses from the edges of Salvatore's operation, including a man who admitted he had lent Salvatore his private jet for trips between New Jersey and Florida, and who described the workings of the smuggling ring from the inside. There had already been a separate sign of how exposed Ruggiero and Gotti had become when a grand jury, acting on the fruits of the surveillance, subpoenaed both men, along with a group of their associates, to answer questions about organized crime. Layer by layer, the things Ruggiero had said and the people he had said them around were being turned into a case, and the case kept growing even as the trials kept failing to land. Ruggiero's own conduct did him no favors at all. His behavior in the preliminary proceedings was so abrasive and disruptive that his bail was revoked, and he was held in federal detention rather than waiting out the delays at home with his family. A frustrated John Gotti, watching his old friend prove unmanageable even inside a courtroom under the eyes of a judge, passed over Ruggiero when it came time to fill the senior vacancy in the family and promoted another man to underboss instead, a final demotion in all but name. The next trial finally commenced on April the 17th, 1989, before yet another judge, on a streamlined and redacted indictment. By this point, Angelo Ruggiero had been severed from the case entirely, and the reason was simple and final. Angelo Ruggiero was dying. The cigarettes that had given him his cement mixer voice had also given him terminal lung cancer, and the disease was spreading relentlessly through his body, even as the lawyers argued. The case went forward without him, and it reached the conclusion the government had pursued for the better part of a decade. In late May of 1989, John Carneglia was convicted of running a heroin distribution ring. That July, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison and fined $75,000, the same crushing punishment handed down to John Gotti. The men Ruggiero had dealt heroin alongside, the men whose business his recorded voice had laid bare for the government, went away for half a century each, effectively for the rest of their working lives. The evidence had finally done its work. But the source of that evidence, the man whose mouth had created the entire case from nothing, would not live to hear a verdict rendered in it. The tapes had outlasted the talker. And while the trials ground slowly on, John Gotti reached a private decision about his oldest friend in the world. Gotti wanted Angelo Ruggiero dead. The friendship that had survived the prison and murder and the long, bloody climb to the top of the family did not survive the tapes, and Gotti could not bring himself to forgive what those recordings had cost him and everyone around them. From his perspective, the calculus was brutally simple. Ruggiero had allowed himself to be captured on a federal listening device over and over, year after year, narrating the family's most dangerous secrets into the walls, and the consequences had rippled outward to touch everyone, had helped expose Castellano, had built the narcotics case that took down Jean and Carneglia, had become a permanent and unhealing wound in the organization. By the unforgiving logic of the world the two of them had chosen as boys, a man who creates that kind of exposure forfeits his life, and the depth of the friendship counted for nothing against it. It was Sammy Gravano who talked Gotti out of the killing, and the argument he used was as cold as the order it overturned. There was no point in murdering Angelo Ruggiero, Gravano reasoned, because the cancer was already going to do the job for them. To kill a man who was so plainly dying was simply wasted effort, an unnecessary risk, and an unnecessary mess, for a result that nature would hand them for free if they only waited. Gotti accepted the logic and relented on the killing, but he did not relent on the punishment. He formally stripped Ruggiero of his rank as a captain of the Bergin crew and shelved him completely, severing him from the family he had served since he was a young man, leaving him an outcast in the only world he had ever belonged to, alone in his final months. The cruelty of the ending went further than the loss of rank. As Ruggiero lay dying, both Gravano and John Gotti urged the boss to go and see his oldest friend one last time, to set aside for a single hour the grievance over the tapes, and offer some final human mercy to the man who had stood beside him since they were boys on the streets of East New York, who had been suspected of doing the unspeakable for him when his son died, who had called him a brother even while complaining about him. Gotti refused. He was still too consumed by anger over the recordings to visit the dying man, and so the friendship that had defined and shaped both their entire lives ended not with a word of reconciliation, but with a closed door and a silence. There was a younger man who would not abandon him. John Gotti's own son had come to regard Ruggiero almost as an uncle, and against his father's explicit wishes, he kept speaking with the old family friend to the end, one small loyalty in a story largely emptied of them. On a December day in 1989, Angelo Ruggiero died of cancer in Queens at the age of 49. The precise date carries a small uncertainty in the record, with some accounts placing his death on one day and others on the next, and his obituary appearing in the press a day or two after that, the kind of minor disagreement that often clings to men who live their whole lives in the margins of official documentation. What is not in doubt is the shape of the ending. He died estranged from the man he had loved most, stripped of his place, shelved and shunned in the only family he had ever known. The damage he had done outlived him even within his own bloodline. When the next generation of the Gambino leadership came to power, his son and his nephew were passed over for the formal initiation that Della Croce had once secured for the young John Gotti, a quiet penalty for the legal catastrophe the elder Ruggiero had brought down on the family. The son carried the name into the life anyway, picking up his own criminal record across the decades that followed, and as late as the autumn of the year before last, he was arrested again in a sprawling federal gambling case, a small modern echo of a father whose voice had once helped bring an empire down. But the voice did not die with him. The recordings remained, hour upon hour, of Angelo Ruggiero talking, and they kept working for the government long after the man who made them was in the ground. The same body of evidence that had helped expose Castellano and build the heroin case fed into the wave of prosecutions that finally closed in on John Gotti himself in the years that followed. And then the third boy from those East New York streets made his own decision. In 1991, Sammy Gravano turned, became a witness for the government, and supplied from his own memory and his own mouth the first-hand testimony that the tapes could only hint at, narrating from the inside the murders and the structure and the orders. For a few years in between, John Gotti had become something no American mob boss had ever been: a celebrity. The newspapers called him the Teflon Don because charge after charge slid off him, and he kept walking out of courthouses to wave at the cameras in his hand-tailored suits, holding court at his social club in full view of the agents photographing him from across the street. He was everything the disciplined men of the older generation had warned against: a boss who courted the spotlight and dared the government to touch him. The surveillance that the Ruggiero tapes had helped pioneer was the thing that finally caught him. The government bugged the rooms where Gotti talked, just as it had bugged the rooms where Ruggiero talked, and this time it caught the boss himself. The Mafia Commission Trial had already shown what the new methods could do, convicting the heads of the families and handing down sentences measured in the better part of a century, dismantling the ruling council that had governed the underworld for generations. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted of murder and racketeering and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, and he died behind bars a decade later, in 2002, the last of the celebrity bosses, the flamboyant Don who had chosen the spotlight and was destroyed in the end by the very people who had been closest to him and by the very technology that one of those people had unwittingly helped perfect. The voice was gone, but the tapes were still talking, and they would go on talking in courtroom after courtroom, long after almost everyone in this story was dead or imprisoned. The first and only law of the world Angelo Ruggiero belonged to was silence, and he was, by every account that survives, constitutionally incapable of keeping it. That is the whole of him, in the end, the single fact from which everything else in his life descends. The other men in this story understood the rule and lived by it to whatever degree their natures allowed. Paul Castellano kept his distance and his secrets behind the walls of the house on Tot Hill, and even he was not careful enough. The disciplined operators of that underworld built their power on the oldest principle the life had, that the safest word is the one that is never spoken aloud, and the men who lasted the longest were almost always the men who said the least. Angelo Ruggiero could never be one of them, not for a day. He talked because talking was simply who he was. The gossip and the grievance and the endless running commentary pouring out of that ruined voice into telephones and across card tables and through the walls of his own home, and the machines hidden in those walls patiently took down every word. What makes his story matter is not that he was the most powerful man in the Gambino family, because he was nothing of the kind. He was never the boss and never close to it. A mid-level captain who ran his rackets into the ground, bungled the murders he was handed, and owed money he could not pay to men who would die over it. What makes his story matter is that a man of such ordinary rank could do such extraordinary damage simply by being unable to stop talking in rooms the government had learned to listen to. His recorded voice helped pry open the home of a boss, helped build the case that buried his closest partners for 50 years apiece, helped supply the evidence that contributed to the fall of the most famous gangster America ever produced, the same warmth and openness that made him beloved, the very chatter that made him John Gotti's favorite companion and his most reliable ego booster, was the precise quality that made him lethal to every man who ever trusted him. He was, in the simplest possible terms, a friend no one in that world could afford to have. There is a final irony worth holding on to. The men of his world believed that betrayal came from informants, from the rats who sat down with the government and told what they knew, and in the end it was an informant's floor plan and a turncoat's testimony that helped finish them. But the deepest wound was not inflicted by a man who chose to talk to the law. It was inflicted by a man who simply could not stop talking to anyone, who never once decided to become an informer, and yet informed on everyone around him for years, into a microphone he did not know was there. He betrayed the family without ever intending to, which made his betrayal both the most innocent and the most complete in the whole long history of the thing. The men of that life had built an entire culture around the management of the tongue. They touched their chins instead of saying names. They turned on faucets to drown out words. They whispered in hallways and refused telephones, and trained themselves over lifetimes to say nothing that could ever be repeated. All of that elaborate discipline existed to solve a single problem, the problem of the human urge to talk, and Angelo Ruggiero was the living proof of why the discipline had been necessary. The cautionary tale made flesh. He was what the rule was for, and he was the man the rule could not contain. The man who lived by his voice was silenced at last by his own lungs, and the things he had said went on outliving him by decades, played back to juries who had never met him, building the cases that destroyed the men he had loved. He could not stop talking, and in a world built from the ground up on silence, that was the one sin that could never be survived.